Welcome back to the Decline and Fall Show, everybody. We bring you our weekly dive into the gizzards of history to pull out the chicken livers that display the future in order to read in the blood and viscera in front of us the outlines of the decline and fall of the Western Empire. We are your entirely Marxist-Leninist soothsayers for this event, and we bring to you a twice weekly at the moment burst of truth in a world filled with ever greater amounts of, I think the technical term is copium from all sides. Whether it's the Israelis claiming they've shot down 96% of Iranian incoming missiles, or Trump claiming that the war is pretty much over. I destroyed the Iranian Navy. The copium is flowing copiously through the veins of those foul catamites that absorb nothing but the Western propaganda line. So, in order to join me in this dive into the innards of the future, it is Kit Klarenberg from the once and future Socialist Yugoslavia in his undisclosed location in a Tito-era bunker. Kit, how are you reading the innards this week?
Well, I mean, on the subject of chickens, I think that we're getting an unrelenting cavalcade of poached salmonella being served up to us on steaming plates of bullshit. But as ever, we are here to help you navigate this rather slimy, rather unpleasant, viscous blob of disinformation and lies. And I think that at the risk of patting ourselves collectively and myself by extension on the back, I think that we have called this pretty correctly so far. From our initial broadcast when literally hours before the Judeo-American war on Iran erupted, and with our subsequent sit reps, for want of a better word, that we published since then. I think that we've been pretty much validated, but there's still, as ever, a lot more to get into as the war careens from bad to worse for the imperialists.
Yes, indeed. And here we all turn to our first point of the week. Now, we have been telling you for quite some time now. In fact, this might be like our recurring prediction that has been part of our show from the beginning, which is that to understand the nature of the crisis of the West and the fact that they cannot win in Ukraine and now they cannot win against Iran, one of the pieces of the puzzle that you have to understand is deindustrialization and the inability to actually resupply themselves. This has manifested itself in the war against Iran, with Israel apparently running low on air defense and interceptor missiles, with the U.S. itself conceding that it's running low on interceptor missiles, or at least U.S. media conceding that. Now, they are, of course, running low because they burnt through a lot last year. They've that is, the U.S. has given a lot of air defense missiles to Ukraine, and they're also running low on offensive missiles as well, such as Tomahawks, because production just simply hasn't kept up with the demand that this war is placing on it. So the Decline and Fall show has been proven correct in our analysis yet again, and now you've got the consequent crisis flowing from that, which we'll move on to discuss later, which is why Trump is going around saying at one stage, we're going to blow up the entirety of Iran, everything's going to be destroyed, I am the best, I am the greatest, I am the emperor, and then and the next minute saying maybe the war is going to come to a close. So they are, as we predicted, running low on supplies. And Kit, did you ever get tired of being right?
Almost never, and I'm usually only wrong when I think I've made a mistake. In all seriousness, I actually think that so far we haven't really gotten into in a really dedicated way. We haven't gotten into the serious issues around ammunition and production. We have covered this extensively in our past shows, so it's quite extraordinary to see Bloomberg publishing well publicized reports which sound like they've been listening to Decline and Fall about the very, very serious issues around production, commissioning, and replenishing finite stockpiles of extremely expensive, difficult to replace ammunition. And this has been a kind of recurring theme throughout this. Like, I must say that, like, of all places, the Daily Mail published an extensive investigation into how there was a huge cost imbalance which massively favored the Iranians, because missiles costing hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars, were being used to shoot down drones which cost a fraction of that. And as far as we know, Iran can make 5,000 Shah-head drones without sweating, and they probably have even greater capabilities that we don't know about. Almost every day we see the Iranians do something we didn't know that they could do previously, which is like, and they're pulling some pretty astonishing things out of the bag. But yeah, from the perspective of the US and indeed Israel, there does seem to be a widespread delusion that the US can just endlessly produce supplies of Tomahawk missiles and other munitions. They really, really can't. And this is something that, as I say, that we at Decline and Fall have been covering for a very long time. It's something that I've been writing about on my website a very long time. That in both engagements with Ansarallah, both under Biden and Trump, there were alarm bells being sounded at the fact that so many kind of supposedly high-tech missiles and other defensive systems were being used to shoot down drones costing almost nothing, and how there needs to be a mass rethink of US war strategy, as a result. And there was in July 2024, RAND, the Pentagon think tank, it published this extensive appraisal of Washington's 2022 national defense strategy. And a key point that was reiterated endlessly throughout this report was, we are running out of every conceivable weapon imaginable, and we don't have any mechanism for replenishing this, and therefore we need to basically reindustrialize and undergo this kind of revolutionary progression, or maybe regression, to being able to convert or translate GDP into warfighting capabilities. And of course, no one paid any attention to this RAND report whatsoever, and there was no effort to undo decades of outsourcing and offshoring and other measures which have effectively deindustrialized the US, because they can't undo it. They can't, for practical and ideological reasons. It will take potentially decades, even if they were really dedicated and started pumping vast, the amount of money they're putting into data centers, which Iran is now blowing up across West Asia, of course, and other kind of resources for AI. Even if that huge outlay was invested in reindustrialization now, we would not see the results for a very, very, very long time. And I think that this is a concern within certain elements of the power structure in Washington, that, quite frankly, the US is not it's far from invincible, but it is actually rather naked and exposed to asymmetric threats in a way that it perhaps wasn't 30 years ago, perhaps even 10 years ago. There has been a huge shift in the balance of power, not only in West Asia, but also within the wider world, and it's a tilt in power in favor of Iran and Russia and China and other major powers, which aren't on a par with the US, but can still outproduce them, outfight them, and outlast them, as we're seeing now.
Yes, and this is a point that we made with reference to the war in Russia and the war with Russia, and why the claims of like Emmanuel Macron, who incidentally manages to make even more of a tit of himself every time he opens his mouth at the moment. I don't know if you, side issue, but did you see him doing his Top Gun thing, leaping out of a helicopter onto the Charles de Gaulle aircraft carrier to announce that he was sending it to the Gulf to sort things out? And then, like, within a few hours, there was like confusion as to what exactly it was going there to do, except get shot at. So, like, every time this like pathetic, like absolute eunuch opens his mouth, like he tries to look tough and ends up looking completely stupid, or revealing the limitations of French power, which are ever greater limitations, it must be said. But the point to come back to is that you and I have talked before about the fact that Starmer and Macron and Schultz and now Merz have said over and over again that Britain and the EU are going to we're going to reindustrialize, we're going to retool the war industries, we're going to spend more on defense. And we've said over and over again, it's either not going to happen or it's not going to produce anything like the results that they want, which is why, like the British were saying, we'll be ready to deploy against Russia in 5 years, because they know it's not going to happen overnight. And that's why, like, this again goes back to the Russian war, the Russia-Ukraine war, which is why they've been saying, oh, well, if Ukraine can just keep going, it's why their sole tactic is to try and desperately keep the war going, because they think that in a few years they'll have enough defense production capacity to roll back the Russians. It's not going to happen, of course, because they'll just end up throwing good money after bad. And so their chances against Iran are even smaller, because here we'll get into like the nature of this oil crisis again, because the they're trying to address a probably 30 plus years of industrial decline in less than 5. And it's an impossible ask. Like, the only way you could possibly do that is if you the Americans tried to do some version of their own 5-year plan, which I can't see Donald Trump and Pete Hegseth being the men to sort that out. They'd get overruled by BlackRock, Vanguard Group, and the others, who wouldn't want to disrupt the heavily financialized U.S. economy. So the question is not, I don't think, whether this is going to end in a disastrous defeat for the imperialists. I think it already has. The question is, and we'll deal with this later in the show, like, how bad is the defeat going to be, and how much damage are they going to do before they're forced to acknowledge this? Kit, did you want to come back with anything else on the military inventories question?
Well, yeah, well, sure. I mean, I just, yeah, I think it does bear repeating that this is a long-term structural issue within the empire more widely, and it's why the empire is unraveling at an absolutely spectacular rate of knots. And it feeds into all sorts of other issues as well, where we discussed on our last broadcast about parallels between, and we can delve into some of the issues that touches upon in more detail as we go on. But we discussed how there are very clear parallels between the bombing of Iran and the 1999 bombing of Yugoslavia by NATO, and how in the previous campaign, it was a total disaster, which was meant to last a few days, didn't achieve what it was meant to achieve. Resulted in the war strategy, if you can call it that, being shifting from military, because they were getting nowhere trying to destroy the Yugoslav military, and just bombing defenseless civilian infrastructure, and causing an enormous amount of suffering and misery and destruction for the civilian population. And subsequently, there was this wide-ranging propaganda effort to frame the rather flaccid blitzkrieg of Yugoslavia as a major military success. And that myth has led to the empire constructing a military machine which is explicitly suited to one-sided gang beatings of defenseless countries. And this is extremely dangerous, because on top of the fact that it means the US is basically just actually, rather impotent militarily and can't fight actual wars. It's having it's resulted in Americans, but also I think Westerners more generally, having this very skewed perception of what war actually entails. And Donald Trump tried to finesse this a bit, where he said, well, people get killed in wars, and I think that there are very serious issues around casualties, which are not really being talked about. But I think both in Israel, I think civilian and military casualties may run into the thousands, and that's not being discussed, because if it was discussed, people would turn against the war in droves. And I've seen that there are numerous Hebrew-speaking Twitter users who are complaining about the fact that they're spending all of their time in bunkers, and often not even getting alarms before missiles hit. And likewise, I think there's been an enormous amount of American casualties in this, which were not being told about. And I think that once the truth does emerge, then I mean, already this is the most unpopular war in history for the US and indeed Israel, which is saying something. I think an enormous number of people are going to turn on this quite viciously, in fact.
Yeah.
So again, we are very much, and which to say nothing of the economic impact of this, which we'll get into. But it's like, I think that it does bear repeating that for all of the propaganda about, you know, like US precision strikes, you know, they're posting photos of like of rather miserable boats, you kind of you know, rowing boats, claiming that, oh, we've destroyed the Iranian navy, you know, blah blah blah. But like, aside from all of the noise about how Iran is getting battered, and they are causing some pain, and you know, people are dying, and it's horrific. But from a military perspective, this has been a total disaster from start to finish, and I don't think we're anywhere near out of the woods yet.
Exactly. And just to make some further points here on the numbers. Um, First of all, it was. Did you enjoy the discomfort of the South Korean puppet regime when, like, the terminal high altitude air defense system that the U.S. placed in South Korea to great fanfare just a few years ago was withdrawn, and the South Korean president says, "Well, we don't like this, but we have no ability to object to what the U.S. does," which is a brilliant demonstration of just how impotent and absolutely wholly controlled by the US the South Korean regime really is. They have no control, as by their own admission, over what is and what isn't placed in their country, militarily speaking. And the same will be true of all the Gulf puppet states, by the way. So they've had to withdraw their FAD air defense system from South Korea to bring it into the West Asian region. Now, just on that, the terminal high altitude air defense inventory, um, up to between 20 to 50% of the entire US stockpile may have been expended already, and they only produce 12 to 15 of those interceptors every year. Patriot missiles, annual production is only 600 to 650 units a year, and the US is reported to only have 25% of the inventory needed at this stage. And each pack-free interceptor costs $3.9 million versus an Iranian Fatah free 13 missile, as which those are priced at $500,000 each at most. So you see the huge disparity there in cost. And the other point to raise is, like, we keep getting told that, oh, the US is technologically superior, but I would ask the point about, well, what are we basing that on? How do we judge what is a superior technology and what isn't? Is it that it has the capacity to kill large numbers of people? Is it that it costs a lot to make? Is it that it's got a lot of fancy rare earth metals in it? Is it that the brochure that Raytheon gives the defense secretary, along with his monthly bribe, allegedly, to advertise this, says it's high technology? What is all this based on? Well, how is something high technology? So, for instance, the F-35 is meant to be really high technology, but by most independent assessments, it doesn't work the way it's supposed to. So, how is it high technology if it doesn't deliver what it says? Is it high technology because what the makers of it say it is? You see, from just thinking about this for a second, how much of, like, the discourse here is defined by, like, the US and British, like, paid hack journalists basically just writing adverts for the defense industry. Oh, it's high technology. And yet no one ever challenges that claim, do they?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's several points to make here. I mean, I think that, like, yeah, the war in Ukraine was already like a crash course in how US produced weapons and, you know, vehicles and other, you know, kind of war fighting resources are completely useless in an actual war. And, you know, even the Ukrainians themselves have said we need weapons that just work. Yeah, I mean, a classic example would be like the Abrams tank, where you know, there was a lot of like there was a lot of debate and toing and froing and yelping from the NATO brigade about how, oh well, you know, Ukraine should get, you know, the Abrams tanks. That's going to be a game changer. That's going to tilt the balance in the Ukraine's favor. And then, like after much kind of umming and erring, the US very quietly acknowledged that it actually wasn't particularly well suited to Ukraine because Abrams tanks run on jet fuel, and they need to be serviced every single day. And yeah, they would probably run into trouble in a not particularly hospitable environment. Like, oh, I don't know if it's muddy or something, or it's particularly cold, and this is they cost enormous amounts of money. And I think that the Pentagon, being as it is, full of people who grew up reading Ayn Rand, and being into like Transformers and stuff, like they probably had this idea that like, oh well, yeah, let's make it run on jet fuel, that'll make it better. When it doesn't, it just makes it an expensive lemon in the scheme of things. Now, also as well on the South Korea issue, it's actually worse than you're making it sound, Alex. So, South Korea bought these in it bought the THAAD and Patriot systems in 2017, and despite all of the hype in the media about how this showed that South Korea is firmly entrenching itself on the side of like Western democracy, blah, blah, that like actually it was completely ruinous and catastrophic because China was very, very, very unhappy with it. Now, bearing in mind that the South Korea basically neighbors China, and China is South Korea's largest trading partner. China responded very badly to this. So Chinese tourism to South Korea basically just was eradicated. It plummeted to almost zero. A series of businesses with significant exposure to China shut down, and that includes Hyundai. And K-pop, which used to be cool 10 years ago or so, it completely vanished from Chinese media. So, I mean, that was already a massive hit to South Korean and Chinese relations, which carried with it an enormous price tag and the billions of dollars. But also, the US has just taken it back when it suits them. So this was completely and utterly pointless. And it sends a very clear message to countries that have US military installations and troops and the whole kit and caboodle that these supposed defense measures don't make you safe, and they're fair weather as well. They can be yanked back at any time, and you can say and do nothing about it.
Yeah.
And they'll probably make you a target in a future war, as we're seeing in West Asia right now.
Yeah. Just and to encourage viewers and listeners to go back and check our back catalog, Kit and I have discussed before how if you're buying American equipment, there is every chance that the Americans have put like a back door into the computer system that runs it to enable them to switch it off should it ever fall into hands that would be hostile to them, or simply that they want to put pressure on you. I think the same is true for like all that's the crap that the British have been buying off the US. So the F-35 jet, which is going to be like the mainstay of the British Royal Air Force now, and also like the equipment that goes into the British nuclear submarines. We all know that the British independent nuclear deterrent is essentially controlled by the United States, and that the submarine software, it comes from the United States and is going to be the United States is going to give itself a backdoor into it to shut it off if, for whatever reason, any British government displeases them. So if you're buying American, you are buying something that can not only be turned on you or turned off at their leisure, but also that they can just take back, because there'll be the ability of them to take it back off the South Koreans. I didn't even know that the South Koreans have been compelled to buy that. And by the way, I bet they were compelled to buy that, because I bet if it was 2018, it would have been Trump that would have been saying, "This is great. You should totally buy this. You should buy this now, and you'll be very nice to me if you buy this." And they were compelled to buy it, then just have it stolen back again. Because like, again, like if you're buying from the US, it is basically you are making your armed forces into something that by remote control is under the influence of the United States. Same is true for all of these NATO systems. So all the NATO countries buying US weaponry, they're all buying something which is not only not as in any way like anything like as good as it claims to be, but also is something which either the US can seize off you or that the US can switch off. So anybody with half a brain should take note of this and plan accordingly, I think. Did you have anything else on the weaponry question, or should we proceed onwards through the downward spiral?
Let's shift a bit further down the downward spiral. Why not?
Okay.
Let's do it.
So downward spiral for the empire, upward spiral for the liberation movement. So thus far, I mean, the US presence in West Asian region is dependent upon a lot of again, high technology, high risk systems, which are very, very difficult to replace. Again, by the admission of the Western media. So according to like the latest satellite imagery that we've seen from Chinese companies, radar bases have now been hit in Jordan, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar. And by the way, a bit of a side issue, but I think we should really do a UAE special one day because there's an awful lot of evil shit that place does, especially in places like Sudan, which would benefit from the decline and fall treatment, I'm sure. But moving on, these facilities are associated with the Terminal High Altitude Air Defense Systems, and a lot of these have been destroyed. The one in the big radar system in Bahrain was designed to spy on not just Iran, but it was so powerful it could reach into the southern regions of Russia. So it's no wonder that the Russians feel like they're getting a good deal from this war, because the Iranians, with presumably some Russian and Chinese targeting assistance, used drones, very, very inexpensive drones, to take out this massively expensive, very powerful radar system, leaving the US effectively unable to see large areas of West Asia, Central Asia, and southern Russia. So Putin got a bargain out of that, it would seem. Um, Other points to just mention here before I throw back to you, Kip. They're now targeting the bases in Jordan, which were left off the initial target list, and this has been coordinated with Iranian allies in like Iraq and, of course, Yemen, to cause the maximum amount of damage. Now, what this means is essentially, if the damage is as extensive as it looks like it is, that Iranian missiles can fly almost without being spotted for a large distance. Making the US's task of actually intercepting Iranian drones and missiles becoming next to impossible, which might be why the censorship over damage to Israel has been so tight, because it looks like the Iranian missiles can just fly in almost uninterrupted now. But Kit, did you want to comment on the defense of the radar stations?
Yeah, sure. I mean, this is another. I mean, this is it feeds into what we're saying about asymmetric warfare. Is the Iranians, and with the assistance of the Chinese and the Russians, they have, in preparing for this, because they knew it was coming, they have mapped out how to inflict the greatest amount of damage on you, not only the US, just generally, but their war fighting capabilities very specifically. The radar stations that the US has around West Asia, they aren't well defended, if they're defended at all, because they're just used to people not trying to attack these things. And yet they, by neutralizing these sites, it means that the US basically can't, is basically blinded. Like, they can't fight effectively, and there are certain radar stations in, I think it was it in Bahrain perhaps, which this provided radar coverage for an absolutely massive area expanding beyond West Asia, and now that's just gone. And it's like, again, the US was not prepared for this, didn't see it coming, and has never had to fight a war like this. And I might add that you got to imagine that both the Chinese and the Russians will be studying very, very, very carefully what the US is doing and learning lessons from it, and integrating that into their own strategies. And this has been the case, since the very start of the special military operation. A Ukrainian military official very bitterly commented to Politico, in a report that kind of got memory old. I think it's very revealing. But he was talking about how we call it the war of one chance. So, we get given storm shadows or scalp missiles or all these other, or even HIMARS, these supposed game changers, and then they work for about a week, and then Russia finds out some way of beating it or offsetting it or protecting themselves from its effects. And the Ukrainian military official said, well, they're very, very successful in this. in over the course of the various Operation True Promise kind of preludes or Operation True Promises, you may wish to refer to them as, the US has basically followed the same pattern of launches from specific areas or sites or bases, um, and uh, uh, and used the same kind of strategies to counter Iranian attacks. And the Iranians will have learned from this, and the US has learned nothing from them whatsoever. It's very, very, very clear.
Yes, exactly. And now we are looking, and we'll I think we'll move into like the next section because there's even more to say here. The We're looking at now a potential disaster for US imperialism because they're going to have to, they're having to shift troops out of these bases, which have been under very heavy Iranian bombardment. So there's now confirmed reports of at least hundreds of troops. Now, bear in mind that the US has in the whole West Asian region only 50,000 men. So that's nowhere near enough to make any kind of intervention against Iran. So the looks like there's going to be withdrawal from the Al Udeid air base in Qatar. Again, like the numbers there were around about 10,000 men. They're also evacuating facilities linked to the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain. Now they're saying that they're going to redeploy to reduce their exposure to Iranian missile and drone attacks. But the fact is that the US would not have wanted to do this in a million years. And they are now in a position where they will have to be like continually moving their forces backwards. And it remains like an open question as to whether they're going to be able to actually replace these forces, put them back again in these bases, because the fact is that there's the whole aim of the war from the point of view of Iran is to remove the US from the region. I mean, this is, again, we'll go back to what the late, great Hassan Nasrallah, the former Secretary General of Hezbollah, said, again, just after Operation Al-Aqsa Flood took place on October the 7th, 2023, which is that this was a battle to remove the US and the British from the entire region. And it was a battle that was going to go on for quite some time. And now this is the latest phase where the resistance axis is working towards this. And they're now finally getting the US to move back its forces. Now, Trump made a statement recently at one of his bizarre rambling press conferences where he says, hey, the war's pretty much over. So it seems, Kit, doesn't it, that not only is Iran, on the surface of it at least, obtaining their objectives, they're getting the US to slowly pull their forces back, but also that there are some in the US who quite clearly know that they have no means of actually keeping their forces secure there. And by extension, once they've gone, they have no means of returning them.
Yeah, and I mean, I think as well. This is something that we got into in our broadcast before this started. Is there is a neocon think tank called the Center for Security and International Studies, and they published a quite forensic breakdown of what assets the US has in theater, and they specifically made the point that for all of the the noise around the military buildup, it was actually quite tiny compared to like our invasions in the past, including the Gulf War in 1991, and then the criminal Anglo-American invasion in 2003. And actually, the buildup was more comparable to a 4-day long bombing campaign against Iraq in 1998. Conducted by Bill Clinton because he had a certain sexual scandal to distract people from. Now that only lasted a total of 70 hours, and that is the kind of assets they had in the theater that were for this war on Iran. Now, on top of the fact that this was just a total disaster that they were stumbling into, it must be stressed that for all of the talk now of like of increasing American military presence in the region, and yes, like the British and the French coming to assist, although hilariously Donald Trump has said that he doesn't want Britain joining because we're winning, so there's no point for London to get involved. That like that it must be stressed that what the US has in West Asia now represents the absolute total of what they can deploy currently. And it's not saying very much, in fact. Now there is the U.S. Government Accountability Office, which it does publish some interesting reports that usually don't get any media coverage because they're pretty damning. There's an official fact sheet on their website on quote unquote U.S. military readiness, and it concludes that the U.S. is, to say the least, not ready for war at all. And it notes how despite the fact that hundreds of billions are spent on the Air Force and the Navy, and this is over half of the US's astonishing military budget, that the US fleets of air and sea craft are so decrepit that they lack parts. There are significant maintenance delays, and also facilities for repairing weapon systems and equipment, and naval shipyards are in this like kind of completely parlous condition. So I mean, I do think that we are seeing now the extent to which the US empire's power it exists in people's minds. It's not backed up by anything like actual force. Now again, the US can do, and is very willing to do a lot of damage, particularly to people who can't fight back. But the number of people who can't fight back is reducing all the time. And I think that and this kind of feeds into our next section potentially. We're also seeing how again, asymmetric forces can completely blunt US strength and potency in every regard. Now, Iran is trying to is moving to start mining the Strait of Hormuz. Already they have attacked ships that have attempted to travel through the region, because Trump said, hey, it's fine, the Iranians aren't going to do anything, and they've shown that they are very much able and ready to do whatever is necessary to maintain this effective embargo on the region. Now there's no US response to this really. And Iran is laying mines at a significant pace. It's also massively increased its own oil exports through the Strait of Hormuz as well. Now already oil is inching up in price despite Trump trying to back off, and which caused a temporary drop in the cost of oil. The Iranians are talking about shifting the cost of oil to $200 a barrel. I think that we would do well to listen to them, because they have been very forthright in what they in laying out what they can do, what they are capable of, and the inevitable upshot of particular actions, and they've so far been largely ignored, much to the empire's cost.
Yes, indeed. And this, just to add on to this sort of military failure, the exposure of the Iron Dome, David Sling, and Arrow systems in Israel as being completely ineffective against the Iranian missiles, and the astonishingly high level of censorship that the Israeli regime has to engage in to stop people in the outside world, but also their own citizens, from realizing what's going on. Tel Aviv suffered from a partial blackout the other day when an Iranian missile struck one of the big power stations there. There are coordinated attacks between Iran and Hezbollah, and apparently Ansar Allah now, in terms of missile fire on certain Israeli military installations, including the Israeli satellite array, which was hit by a series of Hezbollah and Iranian missiles the other day, effectively destroying it and knocking it out of action. So the reason and the reason why you've got that utter oily tit Clive Myrie and co from the BBC moving from Tel Aviv to Dubai in terms of their broadcast center is because the Israelis are ordering everybody to show no damage in Tel Aviv. If you notice, the only damage assessment that comes or damage information that comes out, it's normally either from Russians who are in Israel, who are on a different mobile networks, or Chinese workers who are recording it on their phones. Whereas and then the snapshots I've seen so far of Tel Aviv are like whole streets blasted out, buildings collapsed. Like again, it's not as extensive as what Israel has done to Gaza, but it's getting closer to it than Israel has ever has before. And just to finish on my point here with two details. In all the wars fought by the Arab nations against Israel from 1948 through to 1973, they never managed to touch Israeli cities. They fought Israeli forces on the ground. But what Iran has done in the 12-day war and now this is more damage to Israel in terms of more damage to its political, military, and technological hierarchy than was ever managed by any of the other Arab states that tried to wage war on Israel in the past. And you've got to wonder with the censorship this tight and with a refusal by Israel and the US to discuss losses, well, how bad must it really be, do you reckon?
Sorry, you cut out at the end, mate. What did you say?
I was saying, um, with censorship this tight in Israel and the US and Israel lying relentlessly about their casualty figures, how bad must the situation in Israel really be, given the severity of the censorship regime?
Well, yeah, I mean, there was some footage floating around of an Indian journalist who claimed that there was, the Israel was basically saying you can't report on literally anything, and that he'd heard about people dying in bomb shelters, etc. It's quite we're not getting a particularly revealing picture of the damage on being inflicted on Tel Aviv, but we do see numerous rocket launches in the sky, which do seem to be hitting their targets, which are overwhelmingly military and in intelligence installations. But yeah, I mean the psychological aspects of this, the kind of the impact on Israeli society is it can't be underestimated, because they're not used to this happening. They are used to inflicting it on other people, and I think in that context, hiding the extent of things becomes very, very, very urgent. It becomes a matter of necessity. Although, I mean, interesting. It's kind of interesting that we've not really seen much in the way of Israeli officials in public at all, or even making addresses for public consumption from some bunker somewhere. Like they're kind of hiding from public view, because they know that even these kind of younger Israelis who are staging all night raves in bomb shelters, etc., probably out of their minds on drugs. They're finding this very, very, very difficult and unpleasant. And then, if you were to be remotely honest about the fact that, oh well, thousands of people are being killed, this could, well, I mean, would almost inevitably precipitate an even greater brain drain, even greater flight of people from this godforsaken, settler colony. So, they need to keep a very tight lid on reality, but you can't do that very, very long. And I think the Israelis have demonstrated themselves to be total liars, and also fantasists, to an extent that even their own population can't ignore it. So the classic example of this was the alleged destruction of Hezbollah, where in October 2024, Israel staged a completely criminal invasion of southern Lebanon, did a lot of damage to civilian infrastructure, killed a lot of people, but Hezbollah held them at bay using economy of force. Now, Israel, at the end of this nightmare, kind of packed up its toys and went home and claimed that Hezbollah had been completely obliterated. And they pointed to the fact that Hezbollah did not subsequently conduct major attacks on the Zionist entity, as proved this was true. Well, Hezbollah have been independently striking Israel. They've been working in direct tandem with Iran since the assassination of Ayatollah Khomeini. So that should dispel any notions that they are neutralized as a force. They have been playing a long game of chess and exerting absolutely extraordinary amounts of patience. That's the reality. That's why they haven't responded. And I might add that a belief that Iran couldn't and wouldn't respond lies at the heart of this absolutely disastrous, war on the Islamic Republic now. But more generally as well, something that I have been looking into a bit recently is how the assassination of the Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. This was quite clearly meant to serve a number of different objectives, and it must be stressed that it was reported in the wake of the 12-day war that Israel had wanted to do this, and the US allegedly shut them down. I'm not sure if that's just propaganda or disinformation, but subsequent to this, Khamenei kind of went into hiding, or at least is not as visible as he once was. And so this was clearly intended to be the kind of centerpiece of this brief bombardment that US and Israeli officials foresaw. Whether they thought that this would, cut the head off the snake, to use their parlance, and would result in the collapse of the Islamic Republic one way or another, whether that was, due to mass uprisings against the supposedly hated but actually widely popular, government, or they thought that Iran would just capitulate because, if you can kill our supreme leader, you can kill anyone, and that this is a massively intimidating and destabilizing for us. The reality was that the Iran's relentless battering of Israel and US bases throughout West Asia wasn't deterred one iota. And vast crowds took to the streets of Tehran in mourning. There were, it caused an enormous amount of anger throughout the Arab and Muslim world. I mean, there have been US diplomatic sites have been shut down in Pakistan. Bahrain seems to be teetering on the brink of all-out revolution, and the Saudis have deployed a riot squad to crack down on absolutely livid average citizens who are very keen on overthrowing that corrupt Britain and America-backed ruling dynasty. But yeah, it was clearly thought that this was going to effectively win the war. And to an extent, I guess that they succeeded in regime change, but it led to the installation of Ali Khamenei's son, who is widely perceived, including by Iranians themselves, as considerably more hardline than his father. He has very strong ties to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. There is much fevered spection that he will overturn his father's long-standing fatwa against the development of nuclear weapons. This is not 5D chess. This is US and Israel being extremely stupid. And Donald Trump has declared he is not happy with Murtaba, that's his name, becoming supreme leader. Israeli officials have also indicated that this is concerning to them. And it speaks volumes about how they are victims of their own fantasies and their own propaganda and their own lives. And I think that's what's going to, in a domestic context, going to finally do them in. Because, I mean, much like with the UAE, where they marketed themselves as this kind of ocean of tranquility where people could live in luxury and, not pay taxes and make lots of money, that fantasy is over now. And the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people who are trying to flee the UAE is a massive testament to that. I think it's almost inevitable for Israel as well, because however this war ends, and I strongly suspect, and I don't like to make predictions, but I strongly suspect it will end with the US and Israel basically stepping back and claiming victory when they are battered and bruised, and Iran is very much still up for a scrap and will have will now have the knowledge to better equip itself and arm itself for when inevitably the Judeo-Americans try it again, which could be in a few months or a few years, but it's inevitable at this stage. So, in that domestic context, people are not going to buy it, particularly at the full extent of the death and destruction is actually, remotely widely known. I think that this is death by a thousand cuts and very much setting themselves up for a huge collapse. And Netanyahu, as I say, it seems to be becoming rapidly a hate figure. And there may be a temptation to just blame this all on him. But he is just a representative of the wider system, a particularly extreme iteration of it. But there are 101 people ready to take his place who are basically identical. And then you have the same set of problems, the same structural issues, namely, in no small part that a significant proportion of the population have other passports and aren't from there. This is a rottenness in the foundations of the settler colonial project, which will come back to bite them.
Well, exactly. And also, talking of being bitten, we are now well into oil crisis territory. As the news came out today of the International Energy Agency coordinating a 400 million barrel release from the reserves of its members. Now, the total reserves across the IEA, as it's called, 1.2 billion barrels. So if 400 million are released, then this is like almost a third of their total reserves being released in order to temporarily suppress the prices that rose, the price of Brent crude, which rose to $119 a barrel, then dropped again to 60 to 70, dropped again back to 80 after Trump indicated that the war might be coming to a close soon. So what they're doing is they're deliberately manipulating the market, and they're looking to drop a lot of oil onto the market to temporarily suppress the price. But if they're going to dump a third of their reserves just to do a price suppression after the war, a war that's barely lasted 2 weeks, then, well, what the hell are they going to do if this lasts for 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 3 months, which the Iranians say that they are more than prepared to do. So so what you've had is the U.S. administration has essentially blinked and panicked after 2 weeks in order to manipulate the oil price down again to stop a catastrophic collapse. But in doing so, has opened itself up to a greater disaster later on, because with the strategic oil reserves, you're only supposed to use them in the event of an absolute emergency. Now, one might argue, if you were in the Trump administration, an emergency would be gas prices hitting unheard of highs before the midterms. But what it does is it means that the oil price temporarily being suppressed if the war continues and the straits remain closed. And also, if you get more events like you had Shell and others declaring a force majeure, which is that where a business can no longer meet its obligations due to unforeseen events over their liquefied natural gas operations. So oil and gas prices are going to spike again the longer this goes on. And it means that they've already blown, if this goes ahead, a third of their strategic oil reserves all the way across the G7 nations. Also what? Also that Trump can claim that the war is having no effect. So this is a potential disaster, basically, that they are creating here. And the Iranians know that. The Iranians know that the time is really on their side. For all the talk of the US of invading here, of taking this small island off the coast of Iran called Karg Island, or using the Kurds to invade, where's that story gone? After we covered it, the Iranians launched a series of very devastating missile strikes on northern Iraq, and the Iraqi resistance forces launched some too. And then suddenly all talk of a Kurdish invasion just disappeared. Incidentally, and again, we have no way of verifying this claim, the Iranians claim to have taken a bunch of Delta Force guys prisoner who were there trying to lead some sort of Kurdish incursion into northern Iran. We will bring you more on that story, of course, if it's confirmed. But the point being that they're already panicking, and it's less than 2 weeks in. So this is going to lead to an oil crisis of worse than 1973-like proportions if it goes much further. And more to the point, it's not just the price of fuel which is going to be affected. It's also oil byproducts such as fertilizer, which are going to be becoming scarce, which means that'll instigate a food crisis. Because if farmers can't get fertilizer, farmers can't grow, shelves start going empty. You start to see an escalating panic in the West where people just aren't used to shortages. So this is a huge problem, which again, releasing 400 million barrels of oil is not going to resolve that. And again, then the pressure will be on the Trump administration or whoever the hell is making the decisions there to actually bring this to a close. But then the Iranian demand comes back. Well, you can only bring it to a close by basically removing yourself from the region, forcing Israel to stand down, and also the other point is removing the economic siege of Iran, none of which Trump will want to do, but he may be forced to do at least some of it. Did you want to come back on the escalating oil crisis?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, again, this is like we have said. It is actually really worth reading the financial media because it's read by rich people who want to get richer, and people don't get rich off pure propaganda. Now, I mean, the alarm bells have been sounded pretty much from day one of this. And to have been largely ignored by the mainstream media and also political leaders. But at the same time, there have been all sorts of movements that kind of that haven't really been getting very much coverage, like the US informing India that it can now resell Russian oil, which they've been prohibited from doing under the latest and most pointless round of Western sanctions on Russia. Because they know that this is very, very, very serious, and it's going to create absolutely massive problems for Western economies, but also for countries that are not energy rich or oil rich. So, I mean, already in parts of Asia, like Vietnam and elsewhere, the governments have been urging people to use car sharing to travel around and also to work from home because of what worries about access to energy. And as I mentioned, the Iranians are perfectly happy to keep pumping up the price of oil for as long as this goes on. They have the means to do that. They have the motive, the completely justifiable motive to do so, and the US does not have the muscle to prevent them from doing it. And this is, I mean, on top of oil shocks, which I mean, this is going to be pretty historic, and gas prices are climbing everywhere, and that will have a knock-on effect on the cost of food, on all sorts of things. That there are other areas of the global economy which have been sent in total disarray by this, which the US wasn't planning for. I'm thinking that a lot of people within the power structure didn't really have any comprehension of at all. And I memean, the global insurance market is in a state of total chaos. There are all sorts of issues around your access to fertilizer and your other kind of vital resources, which already the proxy war in Ukraine has caused an enormous amount of instability, to say the least, which has been felt by average consumers in the form of inflation and good shortages, etc. Throughout Europe and elsewhere. And things are going to get considerably worse now. And I might add as well that even in the event that that the US could completely end any and all Iranian blockage or hindrance of traffic in the Strait of Hormuz. Again, this will take weeks to correct, and that is based on an impossibility, which is the US being able to just very quickly and easily, without suffering very serious costs militarily, just to disrupt. This is contingent on the US being able to cleanly and easily disrupt the Iranian blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, which they cannot do. So I would advise our viewers to be quite careful, to say the least, and take measures to self protective measures, but also you don't. I would argue against getting overly carried away by doom mongering headlines about how, so for instance, Britain has just 2 days of gas left. This isn't true, but at the same time, reserves are shrinking, and this is a real problem which Western countries have no response to whatsoever. And I think that it's again, this is amply demonstrating that to Western populations, but also their governments as well, that their countries are not very powerful in the scheme of things, and that the slightest disruption, slight disruptions caused by less quote unquote economically developed, or at least on paper less militarily strong countries, can have absolutely massive ravaging impacts. And we saw this with the blockade of the Red Sea, which in many ways is as miraculous and extraordinary as that was by Ansarallah, which lasted for the best part of 2 years. The Red Sea is not. It's very fundamental to Israel's trade and their imports and their sources of food and energy and other things. But in terms of the wider global economy, it's still a small component of that. The Strait of Hormuz is much more serious, and you can kind of see before and after maps and graphs of the sheer amount of tanker traffic in that region before this started versus now. And again, this was not something that the geniuses in the Pentagon and the CIA and the White House were seemingly thinking about.
No, indeed, and this leads us to our sort of final point in this show today, which is the vacillations and changing political positions of the Trump administration, because part of Trump's contradictory statements about market manipulation, attempting to bring down the oil price by sending out random tweets, but also they have no idea what to do or how to get out of this. Trump apparently rang Putin and begged him for help in ending this. To which I would suspect that the only Russian response would be, "Well, okay then, Donald. End all support for Ukraine immediately, and we'll consider it." Which, of course, Trump can't do. Well, no, let me rephrase that. Trump could do, but won't do, because of the rabid anti-Russian political position of the entire U.S. Political elite represented in Congress and in the House of Representatives and the Senate, which is so rabid and so insane that even when they're in the middle of a shooting war with Iran, you've got the likes of Ted Lieu still babbling on about how it's all the Russians behind everything. These people are crazed, to say the least. But yeah, Putin will say, "Okay, you're going to end all support for Ukraine? No? Okay, well, we're not helping you then. We will convey to our Iranian friends what you have said." Because basically, what you have now in this situation is really Trump is both the ideal man and the worst person to have in this situation. He's the ideal man from our point of view because he's a concentrated expression of what the empire is in its declining and falling state. If you're an empire management person, he's the worst person to have there because he has no real clue as to like how to go about things. He bounces around like a rotting sack of offal, and is pushed into various different like political positions depending upon who was the last person in the room speaking to him. And when you've got somebody who's that incapable and also is surrounded by people who are completely crazy and or incompetent, it's very difficult to actually reach a point where they have a coherent policy. But given that the oil reserve release will only buy them 2 to 3 months at most, it's still the case that Iran holds the cards here. So the question is, well, how long is it until the US has to essentially declare they've won and back off? I will risk something of a prediction here and say that the longest this will not go on for longer than 2 months, because if we get to the point where they've burnt through the strategic reserves that they've put out there and it's still not ended, at that point, even some of the idiots in the Western world will start to realize that, well, they need to end this on some kind of terms. There is an open question as to whether the Iranians will even let them end it, though, without their objectives being obtained. Kit, did you want to say anything on the political crisis within the United States and the inability of the Trump administration to stick to a policy for more than 18 seconds?
Well, yeah, I mean, it was frequently said that Trump's opinion is whoever he last spoke to, and I think that yes, that means that there's a large number of people who want to be the last person he spoke to. But as you mentioned, but I mean, I just think that it's interesting that there have been attempts, even by leading Democrats, to make political capital out of this, despite the fact that the Democrats were completely signed up to the Zionist agenda, were more than happy to facilitate and encourage and assist a 21st century Holocaust in Gaza, and then lost because of it, and suppressed the report that found they lost because of it. But I mean, I think that Trump is very much in trouble on this, and yeah, there are a large number of pro-Trump bots and trolls who are engaged in mental gymnastics in order to rationalize why Trump doing the exact opposite of everything that he claimed, not only on the most recent campaign trail, but during his first term in office, particularly consistently ruling out war with Iran, amongst other things that he's now done. This is a catastrophe from all angles, and I think that more generally as well, not just in the US, but elsewhere, as we've discussed on past shows, but it does really bear repeating, is the level of hatred that this is fomenting amongst the general public is really quite extraordinary. People can see that this war is basically being waged in order to, further Israel's imperial objectives within, the region and beyond. They can see that their own nations have no business getting embroiled in this. And like we've seen in the UK, where there's just been this tremendous kind of toing and froing by Starmer, who is, of course, very, very well known for flip-flopping, but we've gone from the US is going, the UK is going to send a grand flotilla to protect Cyprus, and we're getting involved in this. This is the special relationship at work. To saying, oh well, we'll only be engaged in defensive operations, and we won't let the US use our bases, to allowing the US to use its bases and assisting them in other material ways. But again, people can see this, and already it is overwhelming, almost unanimous public opposition to getting involved in a war with Iran. Any further escalations from Britain will probably lead to an Iranian response, but will also lay bare the fact that to average people, that their government does not represent their wishes or interests or views in any meaningful way at a time when a large number of people are already of that perspective. And as we discussed, in Germany, in France, there is mass public opposition to this. European governments are looking ever increasingly pathetic, ever increasingly cucked, and ever increasingly just servants of whoever happens to be sitting on the proverbial White House throne. And this does not play well. It does not have it does not have good consequences for the power structures involved at all. And I think that they are every single day they're getting closer to all out collapse. And it's what's quite interesting as well is that as we've again discussed very many times, all sorts of wavering on the proxy war in Ukraine. Like not that long ago, Britain and France were yet again claiming that they were going to send troops to Ukraine. This has just been completely forgotten about now. It's completely jettisoned as a as a strategy, as a policy, and it's not being talked about. And the Western powers are probably quite happy about that. Now, whether that in turn might lead to a reconsideration of whether actually it is better to hop off this, sinking proxy war Titanic that they've shackled themselves to for, kind of inexplicable reasons. Well, there are very, very explicable reasons, and we explained them. But this kind of nonsensical, idiocy of disarming themselves and damaging their own economies in order to, just keep this unwinnable quagmire going on. Because hey, Russia might suffer some adverse effects from it, maybe at some point. Maybe the next sanctions package will do it. I think these proxy conflicts have exposed the crisis of Western capitalism. They've exposed the crisis of Western imperialism, and they are massively accelerating the total collapse of these things. So, I mean, I'm kind of here for it. I obviously don't want this to go on much longer because of fears about the impact it's having on the Iranians. But at the same time, the longer this does go on, the quicker we are heading towards a much better world, I think, or I like to think.
Well, yes, indeed. And I think that this we will cover this end of the Empire War as it evolves from week to week. I just want to throw one final thing into the mix before we close, which is that Japan is to resume purchasing up to 1 million barrels of oil from Russia after having been obliged to dip into its own strategic oil reserve. So Japan, under its supposedly ultra-right-wing pro-American leader, the lunatic Sanai Takaichi, has now had to resume purchases of Russian oil. So that shows you just how bad the crisis is getting. And as the crisis gets worse, we will be here to cover it week by week, day by day, on the Decline and Fall show. We will be coming to you again on Friday of this week with a special live show where we'll be handling your questions. Throw your questions at us. It can be anything from the current Iran war to who's our most least favorite media twat, to the Russia war, to I don't know what was the first single each of us bought on CD, because we are of that generation where that still happened. Now, I urge you all to tune in. I urge you all to check out the back catalog, which you can find on Substack and YouTube. And be sure to like this post, to share it with like-minded individuals who might appreciate this, and to help us supplant the BBC in the ratings of Perfidious Albion, which shouldn't be too hard to do because everybody who watches the BBC is already dead. Now, from my undisclosed location in Scotland, it is goodbye from me for today.
And it's goodbye from me for today too. Thanks so much for tuning in, guys. See you again very soon. God bless you.